I am Marius Døcker, at the Managing Director here at the Business for Peace Foundation. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Steve Killelea for a conversation about his new book, Peace in the Age of Chaos. His groundbreaking work on economics of peace and how it naturally ties in to the business-worthy mindset. Steve is a global philanthropist focused on peace and sustainable development, with a long, successful career in technology and in international business development. Over the last 2 decades, Steve has applied his business skills to his many global philanthropic activities, establishing an international renowned global think tank, the Institute for Economics and Peace, the IEP, and a private family charity, the Charitable Foundation, which now has over 3 million direct beneficiaries. He's a sought-after international speaker, and he spoke at one of our events during our 2019 summit here in Oslo. So we consider him a close friend of the foundation. Today, we will dive into his recent book, Peace in the Age of Chaos, where Steve has definitely interwoven his personal journey as a peace builder with empirical research on how peace can be built and sustained in the world today. So welcome, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I'm really honored to have this opportunity to discuss the book and your journey. Really, it's been a very interesting read, and we are a great fan of your work. So, but before we just dive into it, and maybe for the audience here that may not know you that well, could you just maybe give us your your condensed bio, so to speak, to start it off?
Yeah, no, sure. Happy to do that, Marius. So if we go back, I actually started off as a computer programmer. So it's rather a shy, retiring guy who liked nothing better than cutting some code. And so what came out of that is I invented 2 programs. And then off the back of those programs, I developed 2 computer companies. They both worked in the area of working in what's termed systems management. So the first company ended up publicly listed on NASDAQ, the second one on the Australian Stock Exchange. And they worked with a lot of the highest availability, or the most, the highest availability computer systems in the world. So people like New York, London, Hong Kong Stock Exchanges, major international switches for Visa, American, MasterCard. So made quite a bit of money out of that. And from there, I set up a family foundation to work with the poorest of the poor. So that would have been 25 years ago. And since then, we've probably done about 220 projects around the world. Direct beneficiaries now these are direct beneficiaries, about 3.6 million people. And we worked with the poorest of the poor. And so that took me into a lot of conflict zones, near post-war zones and such. And so it was actually in northeast Kivu in the Congo one time, walking through there and started to think, what are the most peaceful nations in the world? And what do we know about them? Which I could bring back into the projects we were doing. And it was just, how can I put it? It was a simple fantasy question, a little bit amusing. So I went back, searched the internet, and couldn't find anything which ranked the nations of the world by their peacefulness. I thought, wow, that's really important. So that's how the Global Peace Index was born. But that poses a very fundamental question, because a simple businessman like myself can be walking through the Congo and wonder, what are the most peaceful nations in the world? And it hasn't been done. Then how much do we know about peace? And as a business guy like yourself, we know that if you can't measure something, you can't really understand it. If you can't measure it, how do you even know whether your actions are helping you or hindering you in achieving your goals? You simply don't.
Yeah, no, indeed. One of the things that, when I read your book and got more familiar with the Peace Index, is that you outline 8 pillars of peace. And it just strikes me that all of them, businesses have a huge impact, or it affects business in one way or another, and then they can play a big role. Can you maybe to start it off there? Can you talk a little bit more about business's role in creating peace? What have they done, good and bad, and what should they really be focused on?
Well, this is the profound part of the work we've done. I mean, this is absolutely profound. And it really shifts the whole conversation on the role of business and peace. Because what happened, so I'll just maybe something a little bit technical, then I'll come to the question. So we developed the Global Peace Index. And so we've got about 100,000 different data sets down in Sydney now. And so what we did was a lot of mathematical modelling, statistical analysis to understand what are the factors most closely associated with highly peaceful societies. And that's the positive peace you're talking about. And then we did further analysis to cluster each of the different pieces we found together. Then we broke that into what we call 8 pillars of peace. And that's simply a topology. At 8 pillars, it's really easy, it's understandable. And so what we found then is when we turned that back into an index, the changes in it were associated with a lot of other things we think are important, like higher per capita income, better measures on well-being and happiness, better performance on the ecology, better performance on measures of inclusion, and a whole range of other things. So although we started at peace, what we ended up describing was an environment which has an optimal potential for an optimum environment for human potential to flourish. And so that's what positive peace is. Now, the same things which create for a highly peaceful environment, the same things which create for a robust business environment. So like, for example, if you take positive peace and you take the countries which are improving or having a substantial improvement in positive peace, we go back over the last decade and we looked at the value of the stock markets. The ones which are improving in positive peace had a 33% higher return than the global average. And like that is a return over a decade is pretty phenomenal. Similarly, if you looked at the sovereign debt, for example, you can find that improves as positive peace improves as well compared to countries which aren't improving in positive peace. In fact, if you take the most peaceful countries in the world, you went back 60 years, ran forward to today, you'd find the average GDP growth rate per annum is 2% higher. And like that compounded over 60 years explains the success of Europe when it came out the back end of the Second World War. So what I think is profound is the very things business creates on the fundamentals of the very things which create peace. It creates the optimum conditions for business to thrive as well. And I think that's the key message which I want to get across, because a lot of the time people are saying, well, what can business do for peace? But the bigger question is, what does peace do for business? And that is a superior financial return. So now, what are these 8 pillars? Okay, let's have a look at them. None of it will be counterintuitive. So they're things like well-functioning government, strong business environment, equitable distribution of resources, acceptance of the rights of others, good relationships with neighbours, free flow of information, high levels of human capital. But all these things come together systemically. You can't say one causes the other. So peace doesn't create business environment, and the business environment doesn't create peace. They mutually feed off each other, one reinforcing the other. And so obviously there's a whole concept of ethics in business, and that sees a separate question. But what for businesses, what they need to do is focus on these different qualities, and we can explain it in detail how they work, but all those things come together to create an optimal environment for business and an optimal environment for peace.
One of the things that having grown up in a, if you can call it a kind of neo-capital kind of era, the focus on exclusive shareholder value has been a theme throughout my career. I mean, it started out in college, and it's been the overarching theme in every company I've ever ever worked for. And it just strikes me now that when we are, in the age of decade of action towards meeting the the global goals in 2030, we need to create shared value. I mean, and it just strikes me that in a very competitive global business environment, it is difficult to always have a focus on all shareholders, to really take in the fact that they are here to create a flourishing society, while they at the same time have to, compete with their competitors. They have to drive down costs. They have to increase efficiency in a game, really, to remain profitable. How do you see that business CEOs and others can kind of move towards more defining and implementing the SDGs in their business in order to do their part to kind of drive this sustainable agenda forward, or is there just some kind of if you will, a conflict there that it's difficult to really effectively address?
Look, that's an excellent question and corundum. I think many CEOs around the world are struggling with, because let's face it, the CEO is mainly judged on return to shareholder value. But if we start to look now at the concepts of the ESG, for example, what we can find is that companies which adhere to ESG standards do tend to have higher returns over the longer term. And when I think deeply about it, it's not so much that the actions they're doing, it's that the corporations which are looking at ESG have generally got long-term horizons.
Yeah.
And long-term shareholder value is created through looking at long-term horizons. So look, if you look at it like fund managers these days, they're looking at where do they invest. And so an example, let's say, is down in Australia at the moment. So we've got a lot of the energy companies down here. And those energy companies, a lot of them use a lot of coal for their power stations. Now, there's a push within many of the fund managers, because we've got huge amounts of superannuation funds down here, to moving away from coal. Now, this is now depressing the share prices of the energy companies. So the energy companies now are responding to that market pressure and moving more to alternative energy sources so that they can move their share price again. So we're looking into these environments. They're exceptionally complex. Now, there's also a role. Now, obviously, there's a whole lot of basic ethics which companies should be following, because it just makes good sense. It can be the way you treat your employees. That way the employees just stay there longer, and the employees then also bond better with the company and will be more productive. But there's a lot of things which governments can do in these areas. So now when we come back and we look at this concept of positive peace, it works systemically, and talking about systems is a big subject. But what happens is with the countries which are high in positive peace, they have a lot better ability to adapt to change, a lot more resilient in absorbing shocks. So now that comes back to government policy. Business can influence government's policy. So how do you create environments which are the most competitive, rather than monopolies or where you've just got a few companies which control a market and then can manage pricing? So how do you stimulate environments? How do you stimulate technology so that you're actually now got technological change coming through your society, so the companies stay competitive? Okay, that comes back to concepts of human capital, for example, which again are all tied into concepts of positive peace. Concepts of human capital is just not how many university degrees you've got. It can be measured by the number of patents which are issued within a country, by the number of citations for research in particular different areas. So there's all sorts of ways of measuring this other than just saying education. And it can simply be like if you're moving down into poorer countries and the developing countries, for example, ones just coming out of conflict, the levels of high human capital might be just the people who are learning how to make better use of the agriculture, which they're doing. Subsistence farming, for example, how do you improve the yields? That's a level of high areas of human capital as well. So now also things like corruption, they're part of the positive piece. Like corruption is really corrosive on business. So business can work with governments to try and help knock out corruption. So there's all sorts of ways business can work with governments to make a much better environment in which business thrives. So things like free flow of information, that's something which is tied up with positive piece as well. So the accurate pricing of a stock, it's based around the free flow of information, isn't it? Look at the rules and regulations we've got in governing transparency in the markets. But if it's not transparent, then you're starting to move into corruption, aren't you? And so just free flow of information gives us the knowledge to be able to make better choices. And all these things, which also create peace, create these optimal environments for human potential to flourish, and particularly business flourish. So now that doesn't address sort of the ethical responsibilities of businesses, which are there. But it's what I'm trying to say is that the onus is not just on business. The onus is on creating the right environment so that business flourishes and peace flourishes with it.
Just picking up on the point of business and politics, and you make that point also very clear in your book that cooperation at a grand scale is needed to fully address all the challenges that we are faced with. Business and politics goes back a long time. I mean, it's been and I've myself been I don't know. I'm not sure to say lucky enough, but at least I had the opportunity to tour Washington D.C. with a large U.S. Consumer goods company, and I've seen the insides of corporate lobbying. It just strikes me that when businesses in their need to compete effectively, they are extraordinarily aggressive in influencing the political process in areas that could adversely affect their business. So if you are in the oil and gas industry, you will lobby, against, increased carbon tax. If you are in the sugary business, you will be lobbying against or try to, dilute or, any regulation that will negatively affect your business. This goes on around the world at a grand scale, and the links between business and politics and politicians is probably not always very conducive for a global collaboration around a set of common goals to advance society and make sure all human potential flourish. Any comments on how we can, improve, if you will, the multilateral system and include businesses in there in a more proactive way than what we have historically seen businesses do when they get involved in politics?
So I think there's a number of angles one can take with this, Marius. So the first thing I'd say is that the concepts of the well-functioning government and corruption play really, really strongly in here. So what you really need is you need appropriate laws, and some countries have got it better than others. Like you've used the US as example, and we know that sort of because the amount of money it takes to run electoral campaigns down there, it's sort of the money picked up in donations is astronomical, and there's a lot of expectations tied up with the large donations to political parties. But look, many countries, there are many different systems in many different countries. Some do it better than others. You can have public funding for political parties based around the percentage of the vote you've got. So you get over a certain amount, then you get a certain sum of money. You can limit donations to small amounts of money, only from individuals, not from corporations. You can increase what the perceptions of corruption is. Like, well, go back to Japan. I can remember when I first started doing business in Japan. Every time I'd turn up with an expensive gift because everyone gave gifts. And one time I turned up and gave a gift and I saw everyone shudder because the government brought in regulations around corruption. And so me giving a $200 gift to the CEO, that was corruption then, and it was a criminal offence. So after that, no one gave these gifts. So that was one form of corruption which disappeared. So I think a lot of this falls back on the rules and regulations of society. And this can fall back then onto, let's say, if we're coming back into looking at the system again, can be the free flow of information, that the media can actually shine a light on corruption rather than ignoring it. So it's back to looking at an overall system, and sort of sure. So if we're looking at let's say CO2 emissions is a very, very good example. So I think examples would be like the example I gave earlier on about the energy companies in Australia. But what we can see is there's a global challenge there, and so what can happen is governments now can stimulate research into the areas to create solutions. Solar panels, clean energy, areas in example, better battery capture, so you can actually capture solar energy and keep it over times. And we can see, like, putting solar panels on rooftops, so the house now starts to generate a lot of its own electricity. Places like Australia are exceptionally popular where you get a lot of sunshine. So the government sort of can now stimulate other areas in its business through its competitive aspects, which now actually create an environment which is an improving environment. And we can see it. We can see it with the take-up of electric cars, for example, solar, wind. And the technology improves all the time. We'll find that fossil fuels will just get much more prohibitive simply because they're not competitive as a technology anymore.
It seems to be, to me, a kind of as far as businesses focus here, clearly when there is an opportunity to grow very fast for a very long time and save the world at the same time, businesses will jump at that opportunity. Right? I mean, they would, most business people would like to do good and well at the same time. So if there is a financial incentive to do good, they will certainly grab it. But there are a number of other things relating to human security that are not directly linked to, for instance, inventing new technology to combat climate change. There are a number of them that are relating to more normative ideals, values. You can take gender as one, and I happen to believe that if you can't, that's kind of the acid test, if you will. If you can't address gender, if you can't agree that your partner, your sister, your daughter is equal and deserve equal pay, how will we be able to address all these other inequalities, right? So I think that's one. We also have the issue of race, we have the issue of health and education, and a number of things that are not directly or maybe not as immediately profitable as green technology. it just strikes me that that is one area in order to really truly create an environment where all human potential can flourish, we need to address a number of these issues in parallel. Just curious to hear your reflection. First of all, if there's any dialogue between us on this, but also how businesses can play a positive role also on these more value-based dilemmas, if you will, that we are also facing in this time.
So I think this comes around to productivity. And so each of the businesses need to look at the areas they're in and to determine sort of what is their best approach to their HR policies. But obviously, if you're discriminating against talented people, then your pool of talent's not going to be as good as your competitors. You're going to lose out. So I think there's a real need to be able to look at that and really understand it well. But you do find today, and it may change in time, but the genders do move towards different industries. So for example, my wife, for example, set up a foundation which uses a therapy called play therapy with the children suffering from trauma. So got 20 employees, not one of them is a man. So coming out of a high-tech background, and I had positive discrimination policies for women there, like through the early 2000s, but still end up with 80% of the researchers would be men. So you've got to, one has to balance it with the industry. You have to balance it with the HR policies, and you really understand your mix well, because in the end, if you're discriminating and you're not getting the best people into the job, you're going to be less competitive than those which are. And I think that's for businesses at the core of the your diversity argument. But when we're looking at the positive piece, for example, and we look at it, and I'll talk specifically about Western democracies at the moment. So there's three components if you look at positive peace. One's attitudes, institutions, and structures. And structures are things like life expectancy, average per capita income, maternal and child mortality rates, things like that. Unless you end up in really bad depressions or wars, they just tend to slowly improve. Institutions, on the other hand, we're looking in the Western democracies, it's been pretty flat, okay? In the last decade, it's just hovered around, without much change. But if we look at the attitudes, there's been vast deteriorations in the attitudes. So what do attitudes mean? So they're attitudes to corruption. So in the Western democracies, the perceptions, and you can only measure perceptions of corruption, are on the increase. You find the fractionalised elites. That's where the elites of the societies fight amongst themselves. That's deteriorated, and you can see that expressed, let's say, in Brexit. You can see it expressed in the last US presidential election, for example. So that fractionalised elites. Group grievances, that's the grievances between the groups. And that quite often comes back to a debate on inclusion and other things, but group grievances are on the rise. Perceptions of the inequality, and in many ways the inequalities on the rise. I think one of the perverse things which has come out of the recession induced by COVID-19 and the government's responses is they've tried to keep the economies going by pumping really cheap money in. So now that money, as it's been pumped into the societies, now the people who can actually get access to the money, or the people who can borrow, are borrowing at exceedingly cheap rates. And where are they putting the money? Into the stock markets and into housing. And so now you've got this asset inflation going on, but that's really just increasing the gap between those that have and those who have not. That comes back to levels of inequality. You found things like working conditions have been eroding, along with wages in many industries. And sometimes that can be good for companies in the short term, for companies for competition, but in the longer run, it creates people who are dissatisfied and look for more radical alternatives to elect into government, which in the long run isn't good for business. But that's back to sort of governments and the rules and regulations which governments pass around sort of creating equitable distribution of resources. So we look at it in a bigger picture. What we find is that we live in a consumer society. And so this consumer society we live in, that's how business makes its money. So if the average consumer is earning less, they're going to have less money to spend, which means it's much harder for businesses to grow their markets. The way we've been compensating for that has been lowering interest rates so people could take on more debt so they could spend. But at some point, that's unsustainable, and it's not that far off.
And yeah, no, that's clearly not a sustainable proposition. And it just seems to me, and you brought up the U.S. election and the divide between the elites. It just brings me to the point of wealth creation. In a highly technological age, and we're seeing the growing gap between the famous 1% and the 99%, and it just it occurs to me that there is a huge group of people, not to get into an analysis of the US election, but there is a huge group of people that has been not attended to for a very long time. They're not receiving raises, their jobs have eroded, their healthcare has been taken away, and simply their hopes for the future have been more or less completely destroyed. So in that scenario, they are in a sense easy picking for people coming around to offer them something, because they have been let down a number of times. The liberal elite, if you will, have been focused on other things, and you can all of a sudden get to a point where we've seen, I think, in the US and many other Western democracies, there's a growing divide between the fractions, and it seems difficult to kind of come to some kind of consensus across these party lines in order to really address some of the fundamental things we need to address. You talk about education, but just simply providing or coming up with good solution to the many problems. Seems we need some kind of greater collaboration that is made very difficult by this increasing divide. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if you.
Yeah, it's difficult. Yeah, it's difficult, and certainly it's an issue with our age. So a lot of focus on diversity at the moment. Okay, and it's good. Okay, it's not that there's anything wrong with it, but at another angle, we need to understand what brings us together, not what separates us apart. And so, and that's if you like, called cohesion. And certainly societies which are cohesive tend to perform better over the long run. So it's one, we need to be able to understand diversity and to be able to celebrate diversity. But on the other hand, we really need to understand what is the cohesion, what brings us together, what are the shared values which we have. And at this stage, I think the debate is around what separates us. It's not around where do we find those common values. And the media, to a large extent, has a role to play in this, because let's face it, the media is, as we're finding, as the media is getting challenged by digital platforms, rising social media, it's getting more and more sensationalist. It's very hard to pick up any newspaper these days or any media channel which doesn't actually already start with a bias, with the aim to try and have its content appeal to a certain audience. So so this stuff is very, very difficult. And it does move through cycles. I'm finding more and more people now are starting to try and find news services which they think is independent and unbiased. So it's a very, very difficult question, and these are, how can I put it? They're difficult questions. How do you change a society and move it? This comes back to the concept of systems. So if we're looking at systems, there's this concept called path dependency. So all systems are moving down a path, and if you like, you can see that that's the history of a nation. It's really tied to its history. It's tied to its values. The values keep moving it down and trajecting it into the future. And so in some ways, all systems are moving in what you could call virtuous or vicious cycles, without wanting to overplay those words, but we'll use them for drama, if you like, Marius, drama. So if you're looking at it, so societies which now have got, let's say, and we'll look at it through the positive piece, they've got the right structures in place, the society keeps on improving because one thing interacts with another, which then builds up more strengths and more adaptability. On the other hand, if you've sort of got resources, limited resources, people fight over those resources then become more limited. You can see this playing out, let's say, in the Sahel in Africa currently, become less resources, therefore more fighting, and now you're into a vicious cycle. And you can see that to a lesser extent, arguing over resources within Western democracies. Because if fewer people are getting more resources, then the rest of the people are more likely to fight over what's remaining.